Today's speaker, Irfan Mirza, is a joy for me to introduce because he's so clearly a Renaissance man, and I don't use that term lightly. You will hear today about one part of Irfan's very interesting life. The time he spent in Sarajevo in the 1990s during the city's siege by Serb paramilitary forces. This part of Irfan's life is reflected in his involvement with the group Voices of the Bosnian Genocide, which is a Seattle-based nonprofit organization devoted to raising awareness and educating the public about the genocide that took place in Bosnia-Herzegovina in the 1990s. Irfan has also served on the Board of Trustees of the Advisory Council for Bosnia-Herzegovina in Washington, D.C., and he's the author of an award-winning book, A History of Bosnia-Herzegovina.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Usually after an introduction like that, the best thing to do is just like walk out and just say, yeah, that was great.
Mic drop.
Only one small correction to everything that Steve said. I was born a couple of years after the Renaissance. Okay, so but yeah, thank you very much. And all of it is that I think I've lived a few lifetimes simply because life is so demanding and the obligations on us to fulfill our role in it are so pressing, and the needs are so pressing. Like, dog walked into this class while that door was open and was thirsty. One of us would take our water bottle and we'd do something, right? It's not because we see any greatness in doing that we do it. Acts of kindness come because that's how humans are. That's our nature in general. But there are times when our kindness is something that is swept over by ambitions, by aspirations, by things we want to do. And it's that check and balance between what we want to accomplish versus what our obligation is to our environment, to ourselves, that we have to monitor. And that is a decision, a choice that we make. We ended up in situations of genocide because people made bad choices when it came to sort of understanding what other people were going through. So today's talk is going to be very much around this notion of this duality, this nature of people. And we're going to explore a fair bit about the people who were involved in this genocide. And I want to start off by saying, look, as I was coming here, preparing for this lecture, and every year I take time, I take a couple of weeks actually, to think about what I'm going to say, how is it going to be accepted by you, what kind of influence will it have on you. And this year, I set a bar for myself, and the bar was really focused by this person, Dr. Myrna Goodman. She's one of the probably one of the most influential people that I ever met in my life, that influenced me. And her influence is so great, not just at the times that I came here and I had the opportunity to meet with her and talk to her, but even past that, I still think of her as somebody that not holds a bar for me to try to achieve or sort of get over, but as somebody who sheds light on what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, what I'm saying and why I'm saying it. So these things are all sort of very thought-provoking for me, and that's the inspiration of Dr. Goodman. So I dedicate this lecture to her and her legacy. So let's ask about Bosnia and the genocide. Why is it relevant? Why is it important? And what are the things in it that we could benefit from by studying it, by understanding what happened? There are wars going on today. Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, other places that are steeping or at the verge of bringing about tensions that could end this way. We've seen a lot of genocides recorded throughout our history. And what amazes me is the human incapacity to learn from them and say, can we take measures as a society, as a people who are stuck on a planet? And when I say we're stuck on a planet, we could make it a life that is worth living, or we could make it a life that's full of tension and anxiety, and it's all up to us, right? So our incapacity to learn from all of these experiences to say, can we build a society that's more tolerant? And if somebody says something wrong, can we just, like not overreact to it? If somebody does something wrong, can we have a meaningful conversation and dialogue? So I've been sort of wrestling with this whole thing. As Steve said, my other half of me, my bipolar side or whatever it is, works in technology. And I'm helping my company and perhaps the world in some way ensure that whatever technology we build, especially in terms of artificial, that it doesn't run amok, and that it is attuned, at least aware of the aspirations that all of us have of empathy and kindness. That's a very difficult thing to teach a machine. We can teach it facts. I can teach it everything that's, in some encyclopedia someplace, but teaching it that. So that process and this process, for me, they come together because I get a chance to evaluate my own sense of humanity. And then I say, gee, maybe this is something that probably the company. So yesterday's talk was really all about that and the ethics of what we're doing and how we're going to ensure that we enforce implement our values into this sort of machine-driven thinking that's going on. But today we're here to talk about the Bosnian Genocide. 25,000 pages of documents sitting in The Hague in detail, going through the painful stories of all of the witnesses, the testimony, the judicial review, and the considerations of the chambers, all of that. It's a very rich source of information. The majority of it is available online these days, so it's relatively easy to go see. Bosnia is more than a story of diplomacy failing. It's a story of history taking a twist and a turn in the weird kind of way. Steve said, I wrote a book on the history of Bosnia. In order to unravel my understanding of what happened in Bosnia, I had to sort of go back and re-understand the history, not just read what was written about it, but also try to make things reconcile with each other. And so we're going to cover a little bit of that, and I'll give you some examples today. And then the tragedy. This was the worst atrocity that Europe had seen since the Second World War. And I pray that Europe doesn't see a comparable atrocity in the current war that's going on with Ukraine and Russia. Why me? Well, Steve talked a little bit about me being in Sarajevo. This is Sarajevo Airport, actually. 1992, probably the winter, or coming on maybe fall. So Sarajevo was the home of the Winter Olympics in 1984. And the whole world convened on this incredible city. Imagine Lake Placid, imagine Park City, Utah, imagine Whistler, British Columbia. That was Sarajevo. Imagine Sapporo, Japan. That was Sarajevo. It was a place, Lillehammer, Norway. It was that place where everybody came together. And they had sport, and they did the luging and the jumping off the ski things and all that sort of stuff. It was spectacular. I watched it as a kid. I watched Katrina Witt, the East German skater, just stole my heart. I mean, what an incredible experience. The Marr brothers, the twins from Idaho, they took, I think, gold and silver, and I don't know which one was which, but at the Olympics, it was a time to showcase this gem of a city. And I was there when it was no longer a gem, it was a ruin. And I was there from 1992 to 1994, and I traveled pretty much through all of Bosnia. My mission was to go places where other people couldn't get to. It wasn't that I was trying to be heroic. I just figured I could outsmart the the situation and figure out workarounds, which is kind of what I do in life anyway, to get to where I needed to get to deliver humanitarian aid. And in that process, I learned an awful lot. And since then, I've spent sort of decades studying what I did and what happened there, and then reading about it from what other people have written and talking to people and getting to know the community, and going back to Bosnia since then many, many times. I can't count the number of times I've gone there now. It's hundreds. And the number of days that I've spent there is probably in the thousands. So I kind of became familiar with the place. So that's why I feel like I can speak with some degree of certainty about what I'm saying. In my work, the former president of Bosnia, Dr. Hajsilajic, came to Phoenix, Arizona, and my wife slipped him one of those copies of my book that the public, before it gets published, it's called the Publisher Preview. And so he sat there one evening, I think Saturday evening or something, and started reading the book in the courtyard of the Marriott Hotel. And my son came running, Dad, the president's reading your book. I'm like, okay, good. And he's like, no, he wants to see you. And I'm like, what, like now at 12 o'clock at night? And so I did. Of course, the president calls you, you go and sit with him. And so I went and I sat with him. And he said, look, I'm reading your book. He was about halfway through it. And he said, did you know that the Goths were here in our country, at some point in time they traveled through? I said, yeah, it's page 69. And he flips through and goes, oh, okay. He said, did you know that what happened with Franz Ferdinand, that there's a whole side to the secrets? I said, yeah, that's like page 104. So all the questions he asked, I basically somewhat addressed in the book. And then we got to the end and he said, this is the book I wanted to write. And I said, well, here you go. You're welcome. It's yours. And he says, no, he says, it's yours. So then he got on a plane, went back to Bosnia. His adjutant called me the next day. It was probably like Monday or something. And he says, President's not leaving the airport until I send you his forward. Will you agree to put it in the book? And I'm like, he's not leaving the airport? Yeah, he's not leaving the airport. He wrote it on the flight over and he wants you to put. So that's kind of how the book came about. It's an important book because the thing I did in it that's different than all sort of the other history books is I went to Bosnia and I actually found the geographical center of the country, sort of like, by using this like GPS and all that. And I sat on the field there. Literally, it's a raspberry farm. And there's a big patch of land. I don't know, it's a couple of acres of land. This guy named Jamal owns it. And I sat on that grass getting wet. And he came out and he said, what are you doing here? I said, this is the center of the country as far as I can tell. He says, no, the center's a little bit over there. I said, okay, fine. And I said, how do you know that? He says, well, the Austrians came and they actually marked it. And there's on his barn, there's a little, tag of some kind. And you can triangulate from that and figure out where the center is. So he said, what are you doing here? And I said, I'm looking at the history of this country from this spot. I'm looking at the Galilee and Jesus is being born, but I'm not over there in Bethlehem. I'm here. I'm looking to see when did that news of Jesus being born arrive here. I'm looking at King Heraclius sitting in the Byzantine Empire. I want to know when is it that information, the contact with him, Attila the Hun is doing things over there. I want to know when that comes here, right? So if you look at a history from the place where it's supposed to take place, then it's a different perspective. And so that's what this book became sort of novel and different. And it's going into its third edition, I think this year. Okay. My work in progress. So I enjoy writing. I don't know that I'm good at it, but they gave me a couple of awards for it over the times, and maybe because I do kind of like weird and different kinds of orthogonal thinking in my writing. But I have a couple of books coming out. One is How Bosnians Survived the War. There's an awful lot of stories to be told about that, about camaraderie and empathy and so on. And I'll share some of that, my own experiences there, which is the Resilient Nation book. And the other one is the Clinton Papers. And this became really important because the White House finally declassified a lot of the memos, about 300 memos from the White House during President Clinton's first term in office from 92 through 96. Bill Clinton inherited the Bosnian War. And so in those memos, what I did is that there's about 300 memos. I laid them all out in my living room and dining room on the floor. And then I got the newspaper clippings from each of those days or around those days that sort of referenced events that happened. And then I took my own notes and I made photocopies from my notebooks, and I laid everything out, and I said, wow, this is the story that needs to be told, and that's what this book is. It's a book of sort of the analysis of President Clinton's leadership and how it transformed and how he transformed as a leader over the course of the Bosnian War. So this war has a pretty significant impact on the US. But the story of Bosnia starts with the story of Yugoslavia and the Second World War and this man named Josip Broz Tito, who formed a group of partisans that wanted to resist the Nazi attack across the South Slav region. And Tito met with compadres of his, and in a town called Mrkonjić Grad in Bosnia. It's a really, really small town. It's probably like 10,000 people live there. There's like 3 roads. And they went sort of underground, and they formed this partisan movement to resist fascism and to repel the Nazis. They didn't have money, weapons, military experience or anything. But what Tito was able to do was he was able to marshal the feelings among the people of resisting fascism, and then they started on a very small set of raids that they did against the Nazis and against their allies, who were the Croats, the NDH they were called. It's the sort of the co-opted parts of Croatia and the regime of Croatia that had aligned with the Nazis during the Second World War. And so he started raiding their military camps and acquiring weapons. Over the course of that Second World War, Tito went from having nothing to having significant enough munitions and weapons that he could resist the Nazi withdrawal from Greece, coming back through Yugoslavia, and hold them up for 11 days. Those 11 days become really important because winter set in Russia, the Eastern Front, earlier than expected. And the German forces that were there got stuck on one side with reinforcements not being able to get through. By some perspective of history, by some perspective, perhaps not as authoritative as I'd like to believe it to be, Tito and the partisans delayed the unification of the German armies enough to cause the outcome of the Second World War that we see today. So absolutely brilliant strategist, and somebody I think who had an incredible. So what Tito did after the Second World War, he pulled these 6 republics together and a couple of autonomous provinces, Kosovo and Vojvodina. And he formed this thing called the Nation of South Slavs, basically called Yugoslavia. And that nation became interdependent set of republics. While cement was being produced in one part of one republic, the gravel was being mined in another. So if you needed concrete, you had to work together. So he cobbled together this economic and social interdependencies within these republics. Worked for quite a long time, all the way up until his death in 1989. Yugoslavia was a nation that had sort of gone through the motions of communism, and then they sort of toyed with the idea of trading with the West and free trade and so on. So it kind of became a semi-liberal economy with a dictatorial communist penchant for leadership. And that became the social structure of Yugoslavia. But as things go, the 1980s happened, and President Ronald Reagan's famous words, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And we saw Perestroika, which was the movement that was coming out of the former Soviet bloc, and reflected in East and West Germany, in Czechoslovakia, in Yugoslavia. And so the doors, the iron curtains that were set up before were starting to open up, walls were crumbling, and nations were forming and reforming at the time. Through that, a man named Slobodan Milosevic saw opportunity and started rising through the ranks within Serbia to sort of create a power base. After Tito's death, Milosevic started largely using Tito's tactics, but got himself into a position where he could influence masses by talking about how they are being suppressed by the minorities, by the unwanteds, by those that are causing harm to their nation. And he fomented a degree of hatred that brought tensions to the point that these economic dependencies that were previously created started failing. People didn't want to have to do business with other people that hated them. And that led to an economic decline that came very, very fast in Yugoslavia. At the time, don't forget, as any nation starts embracing sort of Western economic opportunities, along with those opportunities, open up markets, they open up trade both ways, but they also open up credit. Yugoslavia found itself enjoying the benefits of credit without necessarily having the prospects and the potential to be able to fulfill its obligations going forward. So that created additional tension on the system. And of course, Milosevic continued to start a series of speeches that he made that were reminiscent, believe it or not, of what we heard Hitler saying about the Weimar Republic and the debt that it was in the Second World War. George Sotomayor is a Spanish philosopher who said history sort of tends to repeat itself, and if you're not aware of it, you'll become a victim of it. And when I listened and read Milosevic's speeches, I thought to myself, wow, history does repeat itself. Perhaps history is a shadow of itself. And as Mark Twain said, this certainly is what Milosevic did to come to power. And then in 1990s, he started enacting probably against the constitution of Yugoslavia, laws and rules that that constrained the powers that each of the republics previously had. And it's scary to think that in a society that's so visible to everybody else, that somebody can do this against the will of their own people and then sort of get away with it. And that was Milosevic, somebody who believed he could get away with anything that he did. And then in 1991, the republics had it. They were no longer going to tolerate Milosevic's iron-fisted rule, the withdrawal of the autonomy that they previously had enjoyed and were guaranteed by the Constitution of Yugoslavia and within their own republic constitutions. And so Slovenia withdrew from Yugoslavia. And then there was this cascading effect that launched. But as Slovenia pulled out, Milosevic sent the Yugoslav National Army, the army that Tito had built so brilliantly. Over the years, that army had become Europe's fourth most powerful military force, right? After Russia, Britain, France, it was Yugoslavia. And so that army unleashed a brigade or one division against Slovenia. The president of Slovenia created a gauntlet and let them come in. And then he closed the gauntlet. And then he resisted any reinforcements from coming in. So now Milosevic literally had a gun put to his head. And so he diverted his forces to Croatia so that he wouldn't have the military overthrow him, because he sacrificed the division in Slovenia. He made a deal with Slovenia to let them go. There was some bloodshed, but it was a small skirmish. And then the forces that he unleashed in Croatia committed atrocities in a place called Slavonia, which is in northern Croatia, the southern part of northern Croatia, borders to Bosnia, and a town of Vukovar was completely eradicated. That was where I first heard of this whole thing of happening in Yugoslavia, crumbling and so on. And it piqued my interest because I thought, why is this happening in the heart of Europe? Where's the rest of Europe? And why aren't, I mean, I always thought, you know, we embrace civilization as if it's something that we're entitled to. And this was contrary to what I believed was civilized behavior. And then after that, North Macedonia decided that it was going to leave, and then Bosnia held a referendum. And in that referendum, they voted. But by that time, the opposition forces in Bosnia, who were aligned with Milosevic, decided that they were going to foment a boycott of the referendum among Bosnia's Serb population. Now, Bosnia has 3 large ethnic groups, maybe 4 by some other count, and maybe more if you start thinking about what we mean by the word ethnic. But the way they describe it and define it is that there are Muslims who live there. They call themselves the Bosniaks. There are Catholics who live there. They call themselves the Croats. There are Orthodox Christians who live there. They call themselves Serbs. And then there are Jews who live there. They are just known as Bosnians and Bosnian Jews. And then there are Gypsy and Roma people who live there. They align with whichever sort of ethnic group they happen to be living as a minority in those regions where the majority group ascribes itself to something. But Sarajevo was one of the places where it was really hard to tell that the city belonged to anybody, because in Sarajevo, before the Second World War, there were more mosques per square kilometer than there are in Cairo, Egypt. Stop and think about what that means. So you think, well, this has got to be a Muslim city, right? But there are more synagogues in Sarajevo than there are in Jerusalem. And then you guys say, well, it's got to be a Jewish city, right? It's got to be a Jewish Muslim city, right? And then there are churches, Catholic churches, like every corner. And then there's Orthodox churches at every corner. Sarajevo became known as the Jerusalem of Europe, the place where all of these sort of Abrahamic faiths all come together. They intermarried. They worked with each other. They played with each other. They went to school with each other. They did all kinds of things. There were really very few barriers. If you think about a multi-ethnic society, we haven't found one that was as multi-ethnic as Bosnia anywhere. And I've traveled like to more than 100 countries in the world. And I haven't seen anything that's that fascinating as this melding of cultures coming together. So Bosnia had its referendum, the Serbs boycotted. And okay, now you get an idea of, sorry, I missed this one, of the republics that Tito had put together: Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, Montenegro, Macedonia, and Slovenia, and then Vojvodina, which is a province in the north, and Kosovo, which is a province sort of in the south, had special autonomy given to them in Yugoslavia, but they were a part of Yugoslavia. And so what we saw in this referendum was Bosnians deciding that they no longer want to be part of Yugoslavia, because the rest of the republics also had pulled away. 97% of the people who voted in favor of withdrawal. 66 and almost 2/3 of the country voted to secede, to pull away from Yugoslavia. The referendum was recognized by I'll come to a second. The referendum was recognized by the Bulgarians first, and then followed by all of the other nations, the United States, including UK and France, and Bosnia declared it. That was where Milosevic went to, I believe, history. I really do. I don't know if he pulled out a history book from the library or if he'd been studying this his entire life, but he created the equivalent of what I saw and read about, what I read about happened in the Second World War. The equivalent of Hitler, Eichmann, and Goebbels was very simply replaced by Milosevic, Mladic, and Karadzic. The patterns are so starkly similar that it like gives me, raises the hair on my back, as they say, goosebumps when I think about it, because they did the same kind of things. And it took us a long time to understand this. I look back now 30 years of what happened, and I can make these correlations. But at the time that they were happening, we couldn't quite understand them. And I'll detail out what they had done. This is the destruction, right? Unfathomed parallelism. This is Sarajevo. It didn't look like that before the war, but it doesn't look like that now. I'll show you some pictures a little later on. This is Sarajevo. This is a picture that I actually took from my hotel room. You can see where I am. And this is the parliament of the country, set on fire with this horrific weapon called an incendiary grenade. I didn't know what this thing was until they launched it. It blows up in the building, and then it sets everything on fire. And the fire is like really, really hot that it kills everybody. And then as people go in, firefighters go in to try to help and put the fire out and get people out, snipers sit on top of these hills and buildings all around. Sorry, it was like in a valley. And they just start shooting at them. And that I saw and was horrified and terrified to think, like, why are they doing this? And what is the compulsion for it? And why is everybody else not doing something? This is Sarajevo today. The city rebuilt. And as you can see, mosques and churches, there's still a couple of synagogues there that are left. And we'll get to the story of what happened to that very multi-ethnic society during the Second World War and how it transformed. These were the two large commercial towers in Sarajevo, known as Momo and Uzer, and I couldn't tell you which one, and most Bosnians couldn't tell you which one is which. Momo is a Serbian name. It's a nickname that we're into. These are the Unitic buildings. But they were given these nicknames because that's how people saw their society. Uzer is a Muslim name. And so two towers standing in the middle of the capital city, one is nicknamed after a Serb, one is nicknamed after a Muslim, is a real indication of brotherhood. But this is what they did to the brotherhood by bombing and selling these buildings. This is the residential part of Sarajevo. It's a big, long city, basically, with mountains on either side. And snipers took positions either in the hills or on top of these buildings or other buildings. And little militias had formed. Steve talked a little bit about the paramilitary units who took control of neighborhoods and they wouldn't relinquish them. And what you can't see in this picture, but I'll show you, this is the picture I took, so it's not really good quality. What you can see are these little barricades that they had set up, and they had landmines on all of the roads. I mean, the entire country was mined, right? If you're the fourth largest army, you've got an arsenal of landmines that you can deploy, and they deployed them. To this day, we read 30 years later of landmines exploding, ordnances hurting people, losing arms, lives, so on. To this day, despite the fact that Europe and the international community has put a tremendous amount of effort in clearing the landmines. Now, you won't find them in the cities, but you do tend to find them out in the country, in places where very simple agrarian societies and farmers are out sheep herding their flocks. Goats being exploded because they stepped on a landmine. You still hear about it, but they had mined these roads. And it was so challenging that you really, the idea was that nobody could get in and nobody could get out. And that posed an interesting problem for me because I thought to myself, well, if I can't get there, I'm not going to be able to know what's happening. I'm not going to be able to help them. So I actually drove down this, it's called Sniper Alley. I probably drove down it 100, 150 times. I don't know how many times, but they shot at me. And most of the time, I avoided the sniper fire, and they've set up these barriers. These are shipping containers to protect their very precious archaeological sites and their people. Right, so snipers can't shoot across these. First, they can't see, so that snipers are on the other side of this mosque. They set this up so that the people would be protected, and they could actually go and live their lives, like try to find food and do things and meet friends and so on. So that was the environment. There was one time when I was driving down that famous sniper alley, that they didn't miss me. It's actually my driver, a guy named Sad, who was driving. And that's my license plate from Sarajevo. This time what they did, instead of shooting at me, because I used to turn on Led Zeppelin, I'm a rock and roll nut and fan, and there's a song called Rock and Roll. It takes about 1 minute and 38 seconds, and there's a strip of this road that I know if I start with rock and roll, starting, and I gun it, by the time that song's over, I better be on the other side of those barriers I showed you. If I'm not, I know I'm going to be in trouble. And so that race that I used to do 90 kilometers an hour, zigzagging down this road, they couldn't hit me, and I thought I was invincible. But here's what happened. They took out this other insidious device called a Zolia. It's a rocket, shoulder-mounted rocket. And it goes shh, like a Sidewinder thing. And I heard this whistling sound, and I was like, oh, crap, that's not anything that I'm familiar with. And next thing you know, the cars exploded, were turned over. My driver and I both survived. And then they started shooting at us because the car was sort of spinning around. We got ourselves out. And I'm hunkered down, and I'm looking at my license plate. It's glaring me in the face like this. And we're not going anywhere because the snipers are shooting. Luckily, they're not hitting us. So I took out my little pocket Swiss Army knife, and I started my driver's like, what are you doing? I said, I'm going to take this with me. This is me. This is what happened to me. It's a really important piece of my mission. And at that point, I really literally thought to myself, if I survive this, I'm going to tell my story of what happened, and I'm going to try to understand why people did this. So that was innocent me zigzagging through these barriers. This is a sort of a checkpoint that they had set up, and they had these checkpoints throughout the cities. And I took a picture of this abandoned checkpoint after the paramilitary forces had left. But they stopped me at this one. I was there with an Italian convoy, and they were just like yourselves, really. One of them brought a guitar because he wanted to sing and bring peace. Very, very devout Catholics who wanted to bring peace. And others brought humanitarian aid and food and so on. So I had this convoy with me. Ragtag fleet is the best way of describing it, of Volkswagen buses and Fiat, whatever their SUVs are called. I don't remember the name of it. And just people trying to come and help and do good things. We got stopped at this checkpoint, and the commander of the checkpoint came out, and I was in the passenger seat. My driver is a guy named Fabio. And so he comes out and he says, I told you not to come back. And I said, yeah, but I've got medicine and I have to deliver it, and I'll leave. And I know you told me that last time, but also I'm here to escort the Italians. I don't want them to get into trouble, so they're in with me. And anyway, he got mad and he said, my soldiers are going to kill you because I already gave you a warning and you didn't listen. And I was looking at him and I'm going, wow, this is this requires some out of the box thinking to get out of. And the only thing that I could come up with at the time was to say to him, what is it? Are you afraid to kill me yourself that your soldiers have to do it? He got so mad, so mad. He took the butt end of his Kalashnikov and blam, he hit me on the side of the face. I lived. I cut a couple of stitches, whatever. We survived. We got turned away. We survived. And then I went through another checkpoint and we delivered our goods. I got bandaged up and everything else. And grace of God, I think, was upon us. But here's the interesting thing. These commanders and checkpoints, as I crisscrossed through them, what I found was they weren't sure why they were fighting with each other. Really be honest with you. Their leaders knew what they were doing. But I don't believe the commanders necessarily knew. They were taking orders, most of them. Some of them were evil and mean people, no doubt about that. But others were taking. This is an area in the central Bosnia. It's about, I want to say, maybe 2.5 miles from one stretch of this road to the other, between one town and another town, village to village, I guess is the best way of putting it. And this house that you see, the one that's damaged, belonged to one of the commanders that was on one side of this road. And the other house you see right behind it, the red brick one, belonged to another commander, a Croat commander, sitting on the other side of the road. And they had blocked off this road. And I didn't know that they actually lived here. I went on this road to try to get through. And the first commander I met, he said, look, don't go there. They're going to kill you. I said, yeah, but I got, humanitarian aid. I want to go deliver this. The city's been under blockade for 45 days, I think, at the time. And I said to him, but I'll take my risk. You don't have to worry about me getting there. You just let me go and I'll go talk to them and do whatever. So I went, and then the other guy was obviously grateful to see me because he was protecting his town, and I was there to deliver humanitarian aid. I did my thing. They did this whole radio show where they had me talk on the radio about how I got there and what I was doing and everything. It actually turned out that not only did I deliver humanitarian aid, I actually delivered comedy inadvertently to this town that had been under siege for 45 days with no food coming in, no supplies coming in. What happened was the radio show host asked me if I would do an interview, and I said, sure. Then when I got to the radio station to do this whole thing, she said, would you do it in Bosnian? Like 5 seconds before we go on the air. And I said, look, I barely know your language. And she said, yeah, you know it well enough to actually do the interview. And I did. I had picked up the Bosnian language by listening to my interpreters who were with me. And most of them were refugees, and most of them were women. What I didn't realize is the Bosnian language has a very strict construct of masculine and feminine voices. When you say in English, I took this road to go there, it's gender free. But in Bosnian, when you say it, ja sam bila tamo, I was there, you're speaking like a woman. If you want to speak like a man, you have to say ja sam bio tamo, not bila. And I spoke in the feminine. I didn't realize it. The whole town busted up laughing. And the radio host said to me, thank you so much. You delivered comedy to our town. But on the way back, that commander that welcomed me first time said, don't go there. They're going to kill you. I said, listen, I already met with that guy. He let me go through. He's going to let me go back again. And he says, look, I know him. He's a mean bugger, blah, blah, blah. And I said, you let me take my chances, right? And if he lets me through, I will try to come back with yet another convoy and we'll try to bring more supplies to you. So he said, okay. I zigzagged my way through. I got to the other checkpoint. And the first commander who had previously warned me, he said, wow, you made it back alive. I said, I did. He says, I'm surprised that Mustafa let you in. I said, you know the guy's name? He says, yeah. And then he points to this house. He says, that red one's my house. This white one's his. And I was like, wow, you guys are neighbors. And you are like 2.5 miles away from each other, looking at each other through the proverbial sights of your Kalashnikovs. And then he says, yeah, I said, and then he said, we built a barn. It's destroyed. It's sort of back there. I don't think you can see it. He says, we built a barn together and he still owes me money for it. And I was like, he told me a different story. I made it up. He said, what did he say? I said, he said, you owe him money. And he goes, that liar. And I said, but he said you could pay him back with a pack of cigarettes. So he takes out his pack of cigarettes and says, here, go give it to him. And I thought to myself, I'm not a fan of smoking. I'm actually anti-smoking, to be honest with you, because I know what it does to people. But in this case, I should make an exception. Because maybe I can help alleviate the tensions that are between these two factions. So I said to him, tell you what, why did you give it to him yourself? And he goes, what, me go over there? I said, halfway. Show up halfway. I'll bring the other guy halfway. You guys sit down and smoke a cigarette together and see what happens. So I did. I took him halfway there. I went to the other side. I got Mustafa. I put him in my Russian Jeep and I drove back. And I let them out there and I said, here, guys, talk. And so they wandered through this area looking at the barn and talking about what they were going to do and how, Mustafa wanted to bring water to it. And Tomo, the Croat commander, was going to bring electricity to it. And then of course the war started and all of their plans were kiboshed. And for the time that it took them to smoke a couple of cigarettes, I thought to myself, there's peace in this place. At least the commanders aren't yelling orders for each other to attack. So that was a very surreal experience that I had in the country. But at the end of the day, the war was nothing like what I had experienced, because there were mass killings going on in places that I had not even gone to or heard of. And the outcomes of that war were brutal. More than 100,000 people were killed. The siege of Sarajevo lasted 1,429 days. It's longer than the siege of Stalingrad and Leningrad. I mean, it's one of the most horrific stories that you can hear of people starving to death, people not having food, and trying to maintain their dignity through all that. When a couple of years ago the war started in Ukraine, it just brought me back the memories of what was happening in Bosnia when I was there. What you hear in the news about towns being sieged, Mariupol, and towns under siege and so on, the parallels are too stark, and the outcomes are relatively the same, that they end up in tragedy. This is a memorial that the Bosnians have set up in a town called Potocari. It's in northeastern Bosnia. And it is to commemorate the genocide that took place in Srebrenica, where more than 8,000 boys and men were separated from women in the town and then taken out in fields and summarily executed. Anybody that was in hiding, their relatives were asked to call them out and guaranteed assurances by the Serb military forces that they would be let go, that they'd be taken to a different town and released. And when they did call out to their sons and their grandparents, they were all collected and shot. And so it was an outcome that perhaps defied all notions and sense of humanity that I'd ever thought of. This is going back to Sarajevo. In these hills, snipers were hiding, and they had the sort of the highest points in this picture, and they were shooting down basically at the civilians wherever they could find. The total number of deaths in Sarajevo amounted to, I think, about 16,000 people in a city of 360,000. So, not that I'm trying to say that statistically the numbers are one way or another, but the total number of children that were killed, really very innocent, naive children that had almost nothing to do with the war, other than the fact that they were born on one side or another of some artificial ethnic grouping that somebody decided to foment. They finally have a memorial set up for the children. About 12,000 had been killed in that war. And so it remains a city with a very sad recent past. This is the existing Orthodox Church and the existing Catholic Church. They've been restored. The Catholic Church wasn't badly damaged. The Orthodox Church was also not damaged, and they preserved it, and now it is that. This is the synagogue in Sarajevo. It had been destroyed and it's been rebuilt ever since then. Okay. We talked about sort of the ethnic groups, the major religions that are there. Bosnians have a history of tolerance that goes back to probably about the 8th century, maybe even before that, of tolerance of faith and conscience. A lot of different sort of groups traveled through the Celts, the Goths, the Lombards, through very early times in our sort of knowledge of history, traveled through Bosnia. There was a group of people called the Illyri. They traveled and they settled along the coast of the Adriatic on both sides, on the Italian side as well as the Bosnian side. And so Bosnians have had this, sort of cultural understanding of different cultures and have been very tolerant and accepting of them. So you see sort of now how they all formed. And then, as I said earlier, they created these sort of ethnic monikers for some of them because they needed to have a way of identifying themselves so that they could either have political representation, as Fukuyama says, identity politics, or that they needed to have alliances so that they could protect and defend themselves. We talked about a little bit about the history of Bosnia. I traced Bosnia's history back to a very fascinating leader, a man by the name of Kulen Ban. And dating back to about the 12th century, he signed the first free trade agreement that Europe's ever seen. And since then, nobody's been able to sign a free trade agreement in Europe until the European Commission formed this European Union, and they started having economic cooperation with each other to that degree. But Kulen Ban was a teenage boy. He was 16 years old when his father was assassinated, and he became Duke of Bosnia. He was the central piece around three very powerful forces. One was the Hungarian Empire with King Geza. The other was the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire. Don't forget, it's sort of split into two, east and west. And Heraclius and Emmanuel Emmanuel was the leader of Emmanuel Komnenos was the king of Byzantium at the time. And then there were 5 different popes. And I do have to say that I really felt sad that Pope Francis had passed away. I sent a note to my friends in Italy, my contacts there, and Francis was somebody that I absolutely had a tremendous amount of respect for. And I watched his speech in Easter just on Sunday. But 5 different popes who had various degrees of influence in Bosnia, 3 of them sending the Crusades to Bosnia because of this man, Kulen Ban. Bosnia gave refuge to Cathars. These were like offshoots of early Christendom. They gave refuge to Patarines, and more importantly, they gave refuge to a very large Bulgarian population known as the Bogomili. Bogomili were ascetic Christians who weren't part of the Roman Catholic Church. And so at that time, Rome was relatively intolerant of these breakaway Christian sects. And so Bosnia was declared a heretic kingdom. And Kulen Ban's personal story was that John Casamaris was sent by the Pope as the Pope's delegate, and they had an abjuration, which is basically like a jury trial. Kulen Ban was forced to declare that he was a Catholic, and he gave one of his sons as hostage to be taken back to the Vatican. The reason I tell you this story is because for me, all of these different anecdotes of things that have happened come together in a really weird way. And this is going to creep you out because it's something that you couldn't think of in Hollywood if you wanted to write a movie about it. It's this. So now we see Pope Francis passing away. The conclave of cardinals are getting together. There's 130 of them or so out of the 260 that are going to meet. And all 260 are going to express how they think the new pope should be, what the characteristics and attributes are. And then this smaller group of cardinals who are under 80 years of age will meet in the conclave, and then they will vote and decide. And when they do, smoke will come out. And then we'll know that a new pope has been elected and appointed. This whole idea of cardinals voting for a pope, selecting a pope, was actually something that wasn't introduced, wasn't organic to the Vatican. The appointment of the Pope was a political appointment made by the rulers of the countries who had sworn allegiance to the Catholic Church. But when Kulen Ban's son Teos was taken hostage, and Kulen is a very, very smart man, I mean, to the degree that I'm only now starting to uncover. He had trained his son in Catholicism, even though he himself was not born a Catholic. He was a very learned man. And so when Teos was taken hostage, Teos went back to the Vatican and he introduced the idea in the Vatican of the cardinals selecting the Pope rather than the political leaders of Christendom selecting the Pope. So what we see today now, starting after the period of mourning, in Rome is something that I have to tip my hat back to Kulan and say, wow, what a connection in history that that today affects us. In the time of Kulan Ban, there was one other thing which was really interesting. Parts of Bosnia had been ruled by the Roman Empire for the longest time, 400 years or so. And Ban was very interested. Ban means leader, by the way, Duke. Kulinovic was his family name. He was very interested in human freedom. And so he would actually go to the markets and buy slaves and free them and give them a place and refuge to live within his domain, his dominion. And so that at one point during that Roman history, or history of Roman rule, the slaves in a place called Srebrenik, where silver and gold was being mined to support the Roman solidus, which was the Roman currency at the time. The slaves went on strike, and the Roman commanders from the garrisons wrote back to Rome saying, "We need reinforcements." And the commanders wrote back to them saying, "If I send you reinforcements, what are they going to do? Kill the very slaves that we need to mine gold and silver?" So he suggested at the time, Constantine was the ruler. He suggested at the time, why not give them a day off? So Sunday was chosen as randomly as a day to give the slaves the day off. So perhaps we have Sunday off today as a day of rest from our toils, thanks to those slaves who had given up so much. So we talked a little bit about Tito and how he had formed Yugoslavia using this passion against fascism. We talked a little bit about Milosevic, how he fomented the very passion against their own people, against each other. Massive rallies where people, were treating him as if he was a god or a leader of some kind, and they followed him. They followed him to a blueprint that he had pulled out, and where he created this propaganda machine. And that propaganda machine, I say that truth is the second casualty of war, and I say it for a reason, not the first, because that's typically what people say. Truth is the second casualty of war because some crime, some horrific crime is the first casualty. You wouldn't be lying if you had nothing to lie about. So by my weird logic, Milosevic started distorting the truth about everything. And the way he did it was he talked about the victimization of the Serbian people at the hands of sort of the rest of the world, and in particular their neighbors and their compatriots. He followed this blueprint. This is called nacrtanje. It basically translates to a word like blueprint, and it's the blueprint of how the Serbian people need to survive in the Austro-Hungarian time, which is where they had suffered a lot under Austro-Hungarian rule after the withdrawal of the Ottomans, and that blueprint then became the blueprint that Milosevic was going to use to create this notion of a great Serbia, what he called Greater Serbia. If you're starting to see parallelisms between what I'm saying and what you're currently reading in the news and have been reading, I swear to you, it's not intentional. It just happens that history creates shadows of itself in ways that we can start to see patterns that are extremely alarming. And this is a man named Ilya Garashanin. He created this idea of the Serbian people having to save themselves. And they started doing things like restricting trade among themselves by dissolving at the time the judiciary of the nation, and by tending to create a narrative that there are people within our nation who are devoid of a national conscience, meaning that they are like animals. This degradation of humans started along with this idea of the blueprint. They labeled Croats and Bosniaks as deviants, people who are Serbs who have now deviated because of their choice of Catholicism or their choice of Islam as a faith, and started labeling them and denigrating them in ways to say they really don't deserve the same civilities and rights that we deserve as Serbs. And so the idea of creating this variant groups of people, although they were in the majority, came from the fact that came from the era where the Ottomans had ruled Bosnia and created sort of a relatively autonomous province with a lot of economic incentive given to Bosnia. To this day, we see the artifacts and the remnants of that incentive through Bosnia's architecture that you don't really see in the rest of Yugoslavia. And so I asked myself, why were the Bosnians given this favoritism by the Ottomans and everybody else wasn't? The Kosovars and the Macedonians, in some ways, were also given that favoritism. Well, part of it was that the Bosnians, don't forget, I talked about these groups that had broken away from Catholicism or that weren't part of the Catholic fold, the Cathars, the Patarines, the Bogomil. These groups actually had very close affinity to the Ottomans in that they didn't, they saw first the persecution of the Catholic Church, and the Ottomans presented some sort of defense from that. But they also saw values, fundamentally what they call the Abrahamic faith, Judeo-Christian Islamic values that were in common. And so many converted. And then the Ottomans were very smart because they gave tax incentives to Muslims, and they gave them limited military duty. And so through these programs, the Ottomans were able to massively bring about the conversion of non-Catholics and to much degree Catholics as well into Islam. So part of it was that this massive embracement of it, and then the Sultan invested very heavily in Bosnia because of that, and they created a group of elite military forces called the Janissaries, who the Ottoman Empire recruited, and you can read about them, and they have a spectacular history of how they supported. But at the same time that this was happening, Sultan Bayezid saved Jews from Spain and Portugal and Muslims and brought them to Bosnia. So when the Inquisition was happening in Spain, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand were following very strict set of practices where they didn't believe, even among Catholics, that they were going to stay true to the church. So the Inquisition happened, and the Jews were facing, a torment. But Bayezid took them to Thessalonica in Greece and landed them there. But they weren't welcome in Thessalonica. So he moved them, picked them up again and moved them to Bosnia and dispersed them. And so Bosnia has a very ancient tradition of what they call Sephardic Jews coming from the Spanish area, settling in Bosnia. And these Jews brought with them, one of them brought with them a book called the Haggadah, which is now known as the Haggadah. The Haggadah is a book that a Jewish father will read to his son during the Passover, and then the book gets handed on from generation to generation. Well, this Haggadah in particular has in it this illuminated drawing that the Muslims in Cordoba and the Jews who lived there had collaborated on developing jointly. Right? So when you think of today, the relationships between Muslims and Jews, and you think of what the relationship was in 1392, it just boggles me to think, how did we end up there? Right? Why can't we go back to that era when we were helping each other create each other's religious books? Like, really? And that's it. So this book survived. It has a remarkable story. You can read Geraldine Brooks is an author who wrote a wonderful book about the story of the Sarajevo Haggadah. It's called The People of the Book. And the story of this Haggadah is that it came to Bosnia and it stayed there. And it ended up in the National Museum because one of Tito's mentors and prison mates when he was first put in prison by the communists was a man by the name of Moshe Piade. And Moshe was a non-practicing Jew, but after the Second World War, Moshe pleaded with Tito, and Tito allowed Jews to leave Yugoslavia to go to Israel. And so Tito had a reverence for Moshe, obviously, and he brought about the preservation of the Haggadah up in the National Museum in Sarajevo. And during the Second World War, this book was noted by Hitler. And Hitler sent a German colonel by the name of Wehrmacht colonel by the name of Colonel Fortner to Sarajevo to pick up this book. Don't forget, Hitler had launched a campaign against the Jews in a way where he wanted to eradicate and make Europe Judenfrei, meaning free of Jews. And so they were burning Jewish artifacts, destroying Jewish sites such as their synagogues, and obviously putting Jews in concentration camps and killing them and so on. And so Colonel Fortner shows up at the museum, and a man by the name of Dervish Korkut, a Bosnian man, was the assistant director of the museum. When he saw the German convoy coming towards the museum, he knew exactly what they were there for. So he went into the archives of the library of the museum, pulled out this book, and I'm just going to pretend, and he stuck it in the nape of his pants, is how he described it. He used to always wear a three-piece suit. He buttoned his vest, he buttoned his jacket, and he stood in front of Colonel Fortner and said, "How can I help you?" And the colonel said, "I'm here to pick up the Haggadah." And he said, "Regrettably, I already gave the Haggadah to a Wehrmacht officer." And he said, "Yesterday." And he says, "Which Wehrmacht officer?" And he said, "I dare not ask the name of the Third Reich commander who came. I don't know who it was, and I gave it." So Fortner got upset and left, and then Korkut told his assistants that he was going to lunch. He got in his car and he drove to a small mountain, sort of the other side of Bosnia, that hill that I showed you earlier. And he went to a mosque and he gave the Haggadah to an imam and said, "Go hide this book." So the imam took it and put it in with the Qurans that he had in the mosque, and the book survived the Second World War. So I mean, when you think about the collaboration that they had against sort of this common enemy, it was really a fascinating story of how this book, and then of course after the war, the book came back, and Tito in 1956. I don't know how are we doing on time, Steve?
5 more minutes.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So Tito in 1956 had a copy of the Haggadah reproduced and distributed, and one print version of it ended up in New York, and I bought it on auction, and then I gave it to a synagogue because I thought to myself, what am I going to do keeping this book? It doesn't make any sense. But we go back to Sarajevo. This is the river that runs through the town. And 1914, a Serbian radical by the name of Gavrilo Princip shot and killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and that was sort of the beginning of the First World War. There was a lot of consequences as a result of Princip's actions. Political tensions in Europe grew. There was this domino effect with Austria and Hungary, then further exacerbating sort of the tensions, and then Russia and its allies mobilized, and we ended up in the First World War. Long story short, that was known as the shot that was heard around the world was that. Fast forward to Radovan Karadžic's this Bosnian genocide. Karadžić replayed that Franz Ferdinand incident back to the people, the Serbs in Bosnia, to encourage them to engage in this bitter war, to say they're doing to us again what they had done to us. And so peace marchers had started at the time because of all these tensions, and two of them were assassinated. One of them was assassinated. Both of them were shot, and that was the sort of shot that began this round of war at the behest of this man who was a psychiatrist in Bosnia, by the way, who then became somehow their military commander. Concentration camps were set up. Tens of thousands of men were gathered, and Time magazine and a man by the name of fails me his name now. Journalists from all over the world went to Bosnia and started writing about this. And I have a story to tell. President Clinton had said this. At one time, he picked up the New York Times and he was reading it at breakfast. And he called Anthony Lake, his national security advisor. And President Clinton told the story himself. Said, I asked him, I said, Tony, are there concentration camps being set up in Europe while I'm president of the United States? And Anthony Lake said, yes. And so that piqued President Clinton's interest in what these concentration camps were. And this man that you see without the shirt in front of Time magazine is this man that you see on the right. He testified at The Hague and was able to put Radovan Karadzic behind bars. So this Bosnian genocide was planned. It was a systematic extirpation, which means you kill people, you move them, you do things. It fits the classic definition of genocide, and it displaced more than 2 million people. I was there when it happened, and I tried to help as many of them as I could, to whatever degree that I could do. But what I couldn't get past was the level of destruction and the level of harm that the genocide had brought about on these relatively innocent people. Mass atrocities, we watched them on television back here. Right? The whole satellite TV thing had become really, really big. CNN was formed, and they had, Christiane Amanpour was there, Peter Jennings was there, and so on. And so the outcome of it is that there was this sense of international criminal justice that had to be created. So the United States and the 5 powers that run the United Nations, basically China, China, France, Britain, and Russia, agreed that they would form an international criminal tribunal. And then the atrocities were called out. One of the atrocities we learned about was in the month of May, Bosnians in a town called Prijedor were required to wear white armbands to identify themselves as Muslims, very much like the Jews had to wear insignia to identify themselves during the Second World War. Refugees, these are just pictures that I've taken. Concentration camps, I don't know that I have much more than this, but it was a horrific outcome. And then the United Nations finally sent in a peace force, but the peace force itself was taken hostage. And then U.S. started getting engaged militarily because soldiers of our allied nations were taken hostage. So U.S. aircraft started seeing disturbances of soil, called out mass atrocities in graves. And as a result of that, Bill Clinton launched a program that was called, this town is the town of Srebrenica. It was a protected UN zone. The town fell. And as a result of that, there was a very famous conversation that took place between President Jacques Chirac, France, and Bill Clinton, where Chirac said, look, enough is enough. We need to do something. The United States engaged in a military operation called Operation Deny Flight, Operation Deliberate Force, and they pushed Milosevic and his forces away from the safe zones, and they flew 30,000 sorties to do that. It was the first time that the Luftwaffe, as part of NATO, had taken flight in combat operations since the Second World War. So that's the story of and the tragedy of what happened. So we can do questions and answers.
Yeah, so I want to make sure that there is at least a few minutes here for Q&A.
I think I ran over time. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. So a tradition is first question belongs to a student in the course. If students want to make use of Prerogative. Yeah, Ivan.
Hello, my name is Ivan. Maybe I missed it, but you mentioned that Kosovo gained autonomy, special autonomy. What was the reason for that? And then how did they go about to obtain that special autonomy?
So Kosovo had actually negotiated its autonomous position with Tito because the option that Tito faced was either to give them autonomy or have it break away. And Kosovo was a very strong ethnic Albanian community, and there were Serbs living as a minority in it. And Tito was afraid that if he didn't give Kosovo the autonomy that it needed as a member of special member of Yugoslavia, but it didn't have the degree of autonomy that a republic had. Right? And so the Kosovars agreed to that. It allowed Serbs and Kosovars to sort of live together. It's a very small municipality, a province, and that allowed Kosovo to sustain itself, and it gave Tito a mechanism by which not to have this small area break away from Yugoslavia.
Cassie.
So, as you mentioned, there's a lot of parallels from this genocide to the Holocaust. So, were they influenced by the Holocaust, or were they trying to like make it the exact same thing, but Bosnia version?
So masses are rarely influenced by characteristics of horrific events that they see. I generally think that people tend to be good until somebody orders them not to be or gives them reason not to be. The leadership certainly followed and mimicked all of the practices. The idea of concentration camps, the idea of military commanders having undisputed authority, like no due process for anybody at the time. The decision of the commander is the final decision. But that, I think, was copied back from that era. The setting up of concentration camps, the propaganda machine that Milosevic set up was definitely a copy of the propaganda machine that we had seen Hitler set up during the Second World War to label a group of people as being evil, as being subhuman. The denigration of people is something that I believe people have pulled out of the history books over the years to accomplish their goals. So yeah, leadership for sure.
Yes.
So you mentioned, my name is Shalia, by the way. So you mentioned Milosevic's kind of populist appeal and the way that he would, kind of draw these massive crowds and how this kind of helps spread his message of division. Was there ever a point where either the Bosnian people as a whole or members of the Bosnian government were kind of like, this is a little scary, maybe we should pump the brakes here? This guy seems like he's suggesting some fairly inflammatory and dangerous ideas.
There was, and they started withdrawing from. He had a cabinet which was represented, which constituted the representatives of each of the republics. That cabinet was dissolved. He dissolved it and put a gun basically to everybody's head. Either do it my way, or the military will be unleashed on you. There was a point in time where the Bosnians were deciding to have the referendum. Where the first president of Bosnia, Ali Izetbegovic, said to the people around him, his advisors, "We are in Europe. We are a European country. We're in the heart of Europe. There's no way that that anything other than a police action, martial law, is going to happen. So we should uphold our belief in democracy and our principles. And if we don't, because we're afraid of war, then we're probably not a nation that deserves to be a nation." So with those words, Bosnians were encouraged because they had the green light from the foreign ministers of so many countries that, yes, we will give you recognition if you should, including the United States. Right. So we had sent Warren Christopher, Secretary of State at the time under President Clinton, the first time around with President Clinton, to give that message. And Christopher gave a very clear message to Milosevic that, you will not send your army. So they had all the signals. And they were thinking of pumping the brakes, but by that time it was too late because Milosevic had swept in so fast that there was nothing they could do.
Irfan, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
This is a question I always ask the students after you've left,
Okay.
but it's really a question for you. So what,
How about I get graded on this one?
yeah, what causes or what motivates somebody who is 23, 24 to go to a war zone to try to help out? And then what did your family and friends think? I mean, they must have thought you were crazy.
I think they've known I was crazy from long before this thing happened. So they kind of expected renegade behavior from me. What motivated me was really simple. I was running a business. I had just finished my undergrad studies, and I had a major disagreement with my professors. Okay, I was in engineering, and they didn't see what I saw. We didn't see eye to eye on things. The whole world was going digital, and I was going analog, and they just absolutely hated the fact that I swam upstream. But I created a business, and I was relatively successful. I had a thousands of square feet office and workspace in Beverly Hills and so on. And at the time, the internet was sort of starting, and we had this international communications going on with people on these message boards. And I was communicating with a young man in Sarajevo at the time, not knowing anything about it. He randomly sent me a message, said, "Hey, is it possible for you to send me some insulin because we can't buy any here?" And I was like, "I don't know." I called one of my friends, he's a medical student, and he said, "Yeah, you just go to the pharmacy and get it." So I went and got a couple of boxes, packaged it up, and I shipped it through some shipping company, DHL or something like that. And because I was in the manufacturing business, I had a lot of packages coming and going. A few days later, this package came back and it sort of sat in my office. I didn't realize they returned it to me. They couldn't deliver it. And so after a few more messages, I said the package is sent, it's on its way. So I was looking for some transformers, and I opened this thing, and I said, "Oh my God, this is the package. I already told the guy I sent it." So I called my friend, a travel agent in LA, South African man, and I said, "Listen, I got a package I got to send there. I don't know how to do it." I called all the airlines, and this woman at Austrian Airways said, "Sir, there's a war going on." I'm like, "What?" "Yeah," she says, "the airport's closed. There's no way to get anything in or out." So I went to this travel agent. He knows me. He's known me pretty much for, I don't know, 10 years or so at the time. And I said, you got to find me a way to get this package there. And he says, "You're lucky. Come on over." So I drove to central LA. I was in Beverly Hills at the time. And I took the package, and he hands me an airplane ticket. I said, "What is this?" He says, "Well, the closest I can get you is Vienna. You rent a car, and good luck." And I go, "What makes you think I'm going to go?" He says, "I know you." So I got on the plane. A few days later, I rented a Hertz Volkswagen something or another, Polo or something in Vienna. They told me specifically not to go to the war zone. Sorry, I hope they don't see this. And I drove to Sarajevo. And then when I got there, people were shocked that I was able to make it through these checkpoints. And they asked me how I came there, and I kind of did whatever I could to explain to them. And then, and my friend then introduced me to one of the heads of the local hospital, who said, "Look, if you can bring this box of insulin, and you think you can get more supplies?" I said, "I can try." So they gave me this big long list. I drove back to Vienna, bought supplies, and I drove them back, and that was the start of it.
You undoubtedly voided the insurance on your rental car.
I had an American Express card. I'm not sure if it really covered that or not. Yeah, but I did return the car in one piece. It was undamaged.
Other questions? Yeah, Ella.
You mentioned a little bit about how people's perception of like being able to cross checkpoints and like having their neighbors be across enemy lines. How people's perception of what was happening was maybe different from the reality that you were experiencing as far as being able to communicate and to move around. I was just wondering if you could speak on like why you think that perception was so different.
So you kind of biased the question a little bit by saying that my sense was reality and perhaps theirs was perceptive. I think we were all perceptive. I think we were all perceiving things. Even I was perceiving things. Uh, when you're neighbors with somebody, I'll tell you the story of a woman. Her name is she passed away, so now I can tell her story. Ava Cohen. Her name was Coffin, actually. She's a Sephardic Jew, descendant of a Sephardic Jewish family that had come to Boston. I sat with her in one of these bombed out buildings for a couple of days and just we chatted and took notes. I took notes. She was an English teacher, and her story is a remarkable story. And she told it to me in detail, which was basically this: her husband was killed by the neighbor who lived in the apartment building on top of them. Both of them were Jewish. He was Ashkenazi Jew, which is the Jews that came during the Austro-Hungarian ruling of Bosnia, Northern European Jews, and they and so her husband's family was from that, and so these two Jewish cultures, Sephardic and Ashkenazi, came together. She had met Yaakov; he was her love of her life, and her husband, and they had no children, and they survived through all of Yugoslavia. But here's the thing: their friend from Slovenia was a commander in the Slovenian army, had found a way for them to leave, and so they both packed their things. And at the start of the war, they left. But as she got to, they met Rudy at a certain checkpoint, and when they got there, she remembered that she had forgotten a book called Judaica, which is the Jewish history of something like that. So her husband went back to bring that book. And on his way back, he was spotted and he was shot by the neighbor who lived upstairs. And all of their things in their apartment were stolen. So perception is that you trust people because you kind of know them and you don't think that they're going to do these things to you. And then all of a sudden, they do these atrocities. And then you no longer know who to trust and who not to trust. So what they tend to do is form these tighter ethnic bonds because they happen to be in the jam together without really thinking that there's going to be defense in numbers. So what I saw, I didn't know what I was seeing. It took me 30 years sort of to unravel all this to be even able to tell this story as badly as I tell it. But what I noticed there was among the people, a degree of not allowing the victimization that they were being forced to face to overwhelm them, to say that we will prevail, and that's where that whole book about the resilient nation comes to my mind, because I think that is what allowed the Bosnians sort of to survive this very horrific crimes that were committed against them.